lessons on that, and we're first going to, in this first lesson, talk about primarily the building of a relationship through communication. And then in the second hour, we'll be looking at the physical temptations of courtship. I want to go back to the chart on the definition of terms and again make a distinction between dating and courtship. Dating, as we have defined it, is the process of looking for a compatible, godly person to eventually marry. Now that may include dating different people to try and narrow the field down. And of course, you're looking for a godly person, as we talked about yesterday evening, but also you're evaluating the personality of the other person. Even though they might be very godly, they might not be compatible with you in a lot of other ways. So you're observing them and others. But when you narrow it down to one person and the two of you begin to be serious, that's what we're going to call courtship in this series. And we have the definition, the time in which a man and a woman get to know one another better with the possible intention of marriage. These days, I think equivalent to that online would be your Facebook post in a relationship. Okay, so that's supposed to signal that, all right, you've got two people who are serious about one another. I'm not real wild about people posting that, because with some people it's in a relationship, out, in, out. So leave the announcements to engagement. I think that's a little more proper thing to do. And that's just my opinion. So, as I said, we're looking at communication, and of course the verses that we're going to look at apply to any situation of communication, whether it is between you and a potential spouse, or between you and brethren, or people in the world. These are principles that we find in the Bible, and the reason we're looking at these verses is, if you're serious about someone else, you have to develop good communication. That is essential to marriage. And this is when you start seeing if the two of you can communicate on a necessary level. When we look at verses, we see certain verses about the kind of speaker that we should be. In Ephesians chapter 4 and in verse 29, Ephesians 4:29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Now we need to apply that rule all the time, anytime that we speak, anytime that we communicate, anytime that we type something in email or Facebook or wherever, our communication needs to meet up to that standard. No corrupt communication whatsoever. Nothing that is evil, nothing that is vile, nothing that tears down. We should rather, in everything that we do and say, build others up. He says, but what is good for necessary edification. We want grace to be imparted to others by what we say. And that needs to be, to do that, you have to exercise self-control. You have to bite your tongue sometimes. You have to, instead of reacting to something with something that's harsh, you step back and say, all right, how do I need to respond? And how can I put this in words that build, that help, instead of tear things down? Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. Colossians 4 verse 6. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Now the context there primarily talks about how you communicate with people who are outside the body of Christ. But again, the principle is the same as we saw in Ephesians 4. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt. Now let's go into the Proverbs. There are a lot of Proverbs that we could go to that talk about good communication. We'll look at the ones on the chart there. Proverbs chapter 10, beginning in verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a well of life. Now, stop and meditate on that for a minute. Here you have the righteous. Anything that they say is going to be providing life. And when you have a well of water, there's a lot of water. So we ought to be the source of life to other people in what we say. On the other hand, the violence, it says, covers the mouth of the wicked. Let's go further. Verse 20. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver. The heart of the wicked is worth little. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of wisdom. And then in 31 and 32, the mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut out. The lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked what is perverse. So you look at the beautiful images there about the tongue for the righteous in Proverbs 10. You have the mouth of the righteous being a well of life. You have it being able to feed many, brings forth wisdom. And then that's the way we ought to talk in all of our situations in life. So we have this responsibility, according to the Scripture, as one who speaks. Well, there's a responsibility to listen as well. Let's go to James chapter 1. James 1, verses 19 and 20. Great passages on self-control. Therefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear. And by being swift to hear, you're quick to hear. You want to hear. You want to hear everyone out. It's not like you are not interested in what other people have to say or you interrupt them constantly. You're willing to take the time to listen to what other people say when they're expressing themselves. Be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And in reacting to people, sometimes we're too quick to speak and too quick to anger. And he says the righteous man does not do that. Well, going back to the Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 32. Proverbs 16, 32. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. So when we talk about someone who is mighty or powerful in battle, like a soldier, strong, if you're slow to anger, you're more powerful than that man. You show great character. If you rule your spirit, if you show the self-control, you're better than a person who can be so strong as to conquer a city. And this ought to be our goal in how we respond to people. Let's go to a couple of passages that speak specifically to husbands and wives. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them, talking about the wives, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Now, husbands, this is a huge responsibility that's been placed on us. This is a command. So many people, so many men say, well, I just don't understand my wife. Well, you're admitting that you're not obeying what God has to say here because He tells you to do it. He's not going to ask you to do something that you can't do. Understand your wife. Dwell with him with understanding. Well, that takes work. And what that takes is the ability to listen to her, to understand her feelings, understand her needs. Giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. And sometimes men come to the passage and they say, oh, that's saying that women are weak and they're weaker than men and more emotionally fragile. That's not what Paul is saying, or Peter is saying here. It's not it at all. He's illustrating how you treat your wife. You give honor to her as to the weaker vessel. You treat her like, for instance, an expensive vase. Right? You treat her as though she's special. Now, if you have something nice, like a nice vase, what do? Well, you put flowers in it and you put it in a prominent place in the room. You give honor to it. He's illustrating honor. You don't mistreat her like she's a cheap piece of pottery. You treat her like she is expensive, like she is special, like she's valuable. That's what Peter means. And as being heirs together of the grace of life, again, it's assumed both are Christians, that your prayers may not be hindered. So if you treat her in this way, the relationship is going to be a good one. And if you don't treat her that way, it's going to be very hard for you to pray together. He expects couples to pray together. Again, God is the most important part of that relationship. And couples should be in the habit of praying together. But if you mistreat her, it's going to be very hard for you and your spouse to grow any spiritually. you're going to grow apart. All right, let's look at the passage to the women, Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. And, of course, at the beginning in verse 22, he says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord." And, again, husbands need to understand that this is something that a wife does, and she volunteers herself to submit herself unto you. You don't take advantage of that. Right? You don't act like a dictator to her. That's not what being the head is. You are to imitate Christ. We could read that whole passage there and see how a husband is to love his wife just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. You're willing to give yourself for her. But a woman does have to understand that there can only be one person in charge. Now, he's to understand her needs and whatever decisions that are made. If they can make them together, that's great. But sometimes the man has to make a decision. She has to be supportive of that. So that's something that you have to, when you're courting, if one of them says, "Well, I'm not going to submit to anybody," or "I'm not going to submit to you," well, that's not going to work. And if it's understood that the man is probably not going to be considerate of you, the woman, then you shouldn't become married. But it's important when we talk about communication, seeing what's said in verse 33. "Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." Now, this is an important point in communication, because men need respect. And you, as a woman, communicate that by your actions, but by your words. Show them that you appreciate them. Show them that your man is valuable to you, that you're thankful for all that he does for you. And when you compliment him, when you say how much you appreciate the things that he does for you and the family, he'll eat that up. Men need that. And so it's important to, as a woman, listen to the man's needs and thus respect his feelings and his wishes as well. So communication is important with the man and the woman. And so we can look at some basic rules that we need to understand. When you're listening, listen well to all that he or she says without interrupting. Hear him or her out completely before forming a response. And when you're having a serious talk, put away all distractions. You don't need anything distracting you at the time. Turn off the TV or the phone, whatever. Just concentrate on what each other is saying. And never at any time belittle him or her. That is not showing respect or showing honor at all. So when we talk about courtship, the only way you're going to get to know one another is through communication. And in dating, this might not happen so much, but it has to happen now. It has to happen during the courtship stage. And so we've got to communicate and talk and understand one another and evaluate one another further. Listening is indeed the best way to get to know him or her. And I've got Luke chapter 6. Let's go ahead and look at that. Luke chapter 6, verse 43 through 45. "For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." So when you're listening to this person that you are courting, you will be able to tell what kind of person they are, what kind of heart they have. If they say things that are inappropriate, or things that are disturbing, things that are against God's standard, then you can evaluate them and understand that they need to change, they need to repent, or perhaps even more appropriate is, if this is the way they are, I need to stop courting them. I need to find someone else. There's a book by Matthew Kelly that was written in 2005. And the title of that book is The 7 Levels of Intimacy. Now, I'm not big on books or marriage counseling books and so forth, but I thought this one was very good and really hits the point home on the types of communication that are necessary in relationships. There are 7 levels. And when you're talking with people, and this is true if you're going to the grocery store, or you're talking with someone at work, if in a basic conversation, you start out by, well, how are you today? Well, I'm fine. How is your day? Well, okay. Oh, what did you do this past week? Oh, same as always. What's up? Oh, not much. You have your little short things, and do you get to really know the other person with that kind of communication? No, you don't. No. And you might have that communication with the people you run into on the street. But it can't stay there if you're trying to get to know somebody. In a marriage relationship, if that's as far as you get in communication, you're in big trouble. It needs to be a lot deeper than that. And so if we go to the next level, when you exchange facts, well, that's a step in the right direction. So it's like, well, the weather's nice today, isn't it? Yes, it is. Well, the game's going to be on tonight. Yeah, the Mets have won 3 in a row. I mean, these are facts. You know. Oh, that tire in the car is low. Yeah, it is. Okay. Well, that's beyond cliches or little short stuff. You're expressing what you observe. We need to go further than that, don't we? We need to go to opinions. Well, I think that Ted Cruz would make a good president. Well, I think Hillary's a shoo-in. Well, I think in a car, I think red's a tacky color. Well, you know, I think American Idol is the worst show ever. You know. Well, I think vanilla ice cream is way better than chocolate. So you see opinions being expressed. You learn more about the person and what they think. Now, you're not always going to agree with their opinion, are you? Now, how are you going to deal with those differences of opinion? Now, hopefully, you're not going to respond like a lot of people do online and say, well, you're an idiot, you know. I mean, it's really sad what you see these days. If you go and look on a site like CNN.com and you have the stories and then you have comments afterward, it's terrible the way people communicate to one another. Even if the smallest little disagreement, it's automatically assumed the other person is stupid. That's terrible. You'll never gain friends if that's the way you talk to other people. And who would want to marry you? Really? Because you're not going to find somebody that agrees with you 100% on everything. Now, there may be some things in life and issues that are very important to you that you agree on. But how do you know that you disagree or agree? Well, you have to talk. You have to express those opinions, which makes you more vulnerable, doesn't it? Some people don't want to go on that. They don't want to be rejected. They don't want anybody to disagree. They're afraid of that. But you've got to go beyond that. Well, the next step would be sharing your hopes and dreams. One might say, well, you know, I want to be a writer. I want to write short stories. Or, I want to hike Mount Everest someday. That would be so cool. Or, I want to have lots of children. Or, I want to help in finding a cure for cancer. Everybody has hopes and dreams, things that they aspire to. And if you share those, then you're opening up, aren't you? You make yourself even more vulnerable, but you're opening up. You're finding out what's important to each other. When you know the other person accepts you and respects your opinion, it's easier to open up, isn't it? It's easier. Well, the next step would be communicating feelings. And let's go to Romans 12, because this is really something that Christians are supposed to do already. Romans 12 and verse 15. Romans 12, 15. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Now, how are you going to know when it's time to weep with somebody? Well, they have to express how they're feeling and why they're hurt or why they're sad. How can you rejoice with somebody? Well, they have to tell you what's going on, the great things that are happening, and positive things that are good and enjoyable to them. So if you can communicate your feelings to one another, whether they are good emotions, bad emotions, happy, sad, if you can share your deepest feelings, you're beginning to form a great bond, a close relationship. And again, if you know the other person is not going to judge you harshly or look down upon you, it's easier to open up. It's easier to express those things. And of course, if we're the kind of person that holds feelings in and we don't express them, that's going to cause problems not only with us trying to bottle it up inside, but people are going to wonder what's wrong with us. And they're going to be bothered by noticing that we are upset or we have something that we need to express. Well, to go even further into a more intimate conversation would be when you share your faults. And again, that's very vulnerable when you express to someone your weaknesses, struggles that you have in life, the fears that you have, and your failures. Let's go to James chapter 5 and verse 16, because again, Christians are supposed to be doing this already. James chapter 5 and verse 16. Confess your trespasses to one another. You know, we're supposed to tell each other about our trespasses, our sins. Sometimes people want to pretend that they have no problems in life whatsoever. They have no weaknesses, nothing's bothering them, and we give a false impression. And if a bunch of us are doing this, someone who is needing to talk about their own weakness may feel like, I just don't belong to this group because I'm not supposed to have any problems, and I'm having problems. Well, we all have our struggles, don't we? We're all being tempted at various times. We need to communicate that and pray for one another. How am I going to know what I need to pray for you about if you don't tell me? And the more we have people praying for a person who has a specific problem, the more successful they're going to be with the Lord's help in overcoming it. Pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. So here in a courtship, you're getting everything out in the open, and that needs to happen before engagement. And sometimes there are things that have to be discussed in regard to your past, something that the other person needs to know about, something that you've done or something that's happened to you. You get it out in the open now. You don't wait till later. But everyone has a past. Everyone does. When you talk about forgiveness, forgiveness operates on this level. And in a marriage, there has to be a lot of forgiveness. You both are going to make mistakes. And you both have to have the kind of heart to admit your problems and to forgive one another and move on. And then the last one would be legitimate needs. I have 1 Peter 3:7. I don't need to go back there. That's when the husbands are told to dwell with their wives with understanding. You need to know her needs. Now these are needs, not wants. And communicating on this level enables you to act to help the other person, that you both may grow together. And really that should be the end goal of a couple recording. We want to be in a relationship that grows. We want to help each other grow. Now I think this, well, let me show this illustration. You have a person that's closed off up here, but then they're completely open as you get down here. And if you're too afraid to reveal yourself, you'll never get close to anyone. I want to make this point here at the bottom. Common interests may draw you together at first, but they can't build a long-term relationship. And it's true, you might be attracted to somebody at first because you both like bowling a lot. Or you enjoy the same hobbies, you like the same foods. You have the same favorite teams. But those don't build a relationship. You might have a lot in common on the small things. But what you need to see is if you have a lot of common ground on the most important things. You need a common purpose that is important to you both. And that purpose needs to be all about serving God and making it to heaven. And when Sonia and I were dating and then we went to the courtship stage and we're serious about one another, we talked a lot. We spent a lot of time talking. And the more we talked, from my point of view, the more I was attracted to her. This is the woman I've been looking for. We share the same values. And I've been looking a long time. There's building that goes on during the courtship stage. This is where it starts. Again, the definition that this is the time in which a man and a woman get to know one another better with the possible intention of marriage. You get to know one another better. It's like we've got something special here. We're building. This isn't back at the dating stage where we're introducing each other to one another. This is much farther. We're building something special. When you think of the word edification, that's what it means. You're building, and you can build each other up. Well, what are you building? Well, a close friendship, and I talked about that a little bit yesterday. It's interesting that in the Song of Solomon, you have the couple referring to one another as friends. So they're married. And again, you need to be best friends forever. But that's what you're building, a close friendship. And you're building trust. Now this is very, very important. And let's turn over to Proverbs 31. Again, if you've noticed, we've referred a lot to Proverbs 31. And we're not done yet. Proverbs 31, 11 and 12. And this is a comment about the husband's view of her, of this virtuous woman. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Now, this is what a couple should aspire to. And you can't have a good relationship, you can't do any building if there's not trust there. And trust is something that you just don't automatically get. You have to build your trust again over time. And then there's the building of respect and honor in the verses that we read earlier. So here you are, you're starting to become of one mind. It's like Christians are supposed to be anyway. Again, let me quote Philippians chapter 2 and verse 2. Fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. We apply that to brethren, because that's what it's talking about in the context. But please, couples, look at that and apply it to your marriage, to your relationship. If you're courting, apply it to that. You have to be of one mind. As Amos says, in Amos 3:3, how can you walk together unless you're agreed? So you have to have these things. You have to have this open communication which makes all of this possible, and it has to be open all the time. It has to be respectful all the time, and gentle and loving. The best relationship is when the two accept each other fully and completely, faults and all. So if you're courting someone and there's no building going on in the courtship, that relationship is not worth continuing. Let me look at some danger signs. Signs that you need to get out of this relationship, that you need to look the other way, find somebody else. Well, we've been talking about communication. Well, we'll talk about poor communication. If the other person cannot calmly discuss important or emotional issues, you've got to look elsewhere. If they're avoiding talking on that level, there's going to be a problem. If they're doing it now, they'll do it in marriage. Why do you think they'd be any different later? If there is constant nagging, blaming, judging, or vilifying, that's the way that they treat you, they're not going to show respect for you in marriage. Do you really want that? No, you don't. Because you'll be miserable. You'll be trapped. If they are unrepentant or unapologetic, that they refuse to say that they're sorry when they've done something bad or wrong. They refuse to own up to anything. Know that if you continue in the relationship, everything that happens negatively will be blamed on you. Because they'll never open up to their own faults because they're not sincere. They're not genuine. There's pride going on there, and pride will kill a relationship. So if the person you're courting is like this or becomes like this, look the other way. If they're lying to you, that is a huge danger sign. Lying will kill trust. If there's not transparency there or honesty, if they're always covering up, always deceiving you, then they're a very low character. Temper. How do they react when they're put under pressure? If you're dating, you're probably only going to see the good side of them. They're only going to show what they want to show you. But the more time you spend with them, you'll see how they react to different things. Or when they become mad, how do they handle it? How do they handle anger? If they're blowing up all the time, just explode, or they give you the silent treatment, they yell at you, or they try and manipulate you by anger, that's an abusive relationship. One that you have to see the wisdom of not remaining in anymore. If they have a dominating personality, that they're overly possessive, they're jealous, become jealous when you even talk to someone else. They're controlling. This is very bad. Because they're not going to let you be yourself ever. And you're going to be a prisoner of your own home if you marry such a person. You've got to get away from them. If they have some kind of addiction, whether it be smoking, alcohol, drugs, pornography, yeah, put spending up there. Sometimes you have people who, they get down, and so they think the way to lift themselves out of this depression is to go buy a bunch of things. And that may make them feel good for a little while, but that wears off soon. If they have some kind of addiction, and these are serious ones, you need to reconsider. because their addiction is going to rule their life instead of the Lord ruling their life. They're never going to be able to help other people who need help. And they're going to be a slave to their addiction. And not only are they going to be a slave to their addiction, but if you marry them, your family is going to be a slave to their addiction, because it just ruins the household. Danger sign, another one would be a lack of respect. If they start showing a lack of respect for their parents, for any authority figure, if they show a lack of respect for God, that should be a huge red flag for you, shouldn't it? Because if they have a lack of respect for God, they'll have a lack of respect for God's law. Well, if they don't really think the Bible is something that is important to them, or that they're not willing to follow it completely, what's to keep them from divorcing you? Or being moved by what God says for them about marriage? Pay attention to this. If they have this lack of respect or bad attitude toward things that are very, very important, they're going to have a lack of respect and a bad attitude toward you at some point. So again, as you communicate, as you get to know them, which is very important, if you see any of this, turn away from them. Get out of that. You can't have that kind of person to be your spouse. It just won't work. Here's some good qualities to look for. Ask about the person as you're getting to know them. Is he or she happy? And are they a kind of person who is content and thankful to God? Because there are some people who have the personality that they're always miserable, always complaining, always down, always distraught about something. And they think perhaps that if they get married, they'll be happy then. Well, that's not how it works. If they're a miserable person before they're married, that will continue into marriage, because that is a personality trait. And actually, happiness or joy is a character trait. You know, we're commanded to be happy and to joy and rejoice. And that's something you develop in your life. And if that person is not a person who is happy, content, or thankful, then they're not going to be happy with you. Ask, does he or she pray? Do they do that sincerely? Not as a burden, I guess we got to pray, or a ritual, we do it so often. But as a joy and a necessity, as a habit. And if they are a prayerful person, then you have found somebody who is valuable. Does he or she study God's Word? Now, we read Psalm 1 and verse 2 as talking about the righteous man who meditates in God's law day and night, and delights in it. Do they delight in God's Word? Do they use it as a guide, as something that's important to them, and not just studying it as an academic exercise? You have to evaluate about the other person. What are they taking in life? I mean, what's important to them? What are they spending hours doing or watching? Because we are what we watch. We are what we take in. And if the one that you're courting does not have an interest in God's Word, not enough to study it, then they're not quite the person that you need. Does he or she truly fear the Lord? Guess what? We're going back to Proverbs 31. So much in there that is good for us to consider. Proverbs 31 and in verse 30. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain. We spoke about that yesterday. But a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Now, men, women that you're courting, do they fear the Lord? Women, looking at the man that you're serious about, does he fear the Lord? Again, considering the theme of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fools despise wisdom and instruction. How do they reverence God? Psalm 128 I'm going to read that. It's a great passage to go to about this subject. Very short. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. When you eat the labor of your hands, you shall be happy, and shall be well with you. Your wife shall be a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house. Your children like olive plants all around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you out of Zion, and may you see the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Yes, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. So you see how fearing the Lord affects your family to a positive degree. If you fear the Lord, and your family fears the Lord, you will prosper and be blessed. Again, this is a point that we made yesterday, and we're going to emphasize it every time. Your number one goal needs to be that you're going to mature in God together. And that starts here in the courtship stage. God must be first in the relationship at all times. Now, if that doesn't describe the relationship and it's leaving you spiritually empty, get out. Get out of the relationship, because you are unequally yoked. So marriage will either be a blessing to you or a curse. And it depends upon you and who you marry. And so we implore you, young people, let it be a blessing. Again, you have to be careful who you marry. You have to spend time with them to really get to know them and to communicate on that level, which needs to continue throughout the rest of your life if you marry them. Communicate on that deep level. But courtship helps you find the one who can be a true blessing to you for the rest of your life. All right, we'll stop.